I wanted to welcome you. So first of all, good afternoon and welcome to the second installment of Desendeudadas, organized by the Education and Debt Working Group, a transdisciplinary working group on education, financial crisis, and post-debt educational futures in Latin America. My name is Frances Negro Montaner. I'm one of the organizers. And just a few things about the working group before I pass it on to Miguel. This working group emerged out of various scholarly, artistic, and activist engagements with the problematic of debt in the plural across the hemisphere. As we know, during the last 5 decades, neoliberal projects in the region have sought to, and in many cases succeeded in creating dramatic changes in federal, state, and local education funding formulas. And today, public education institutions across the Americas are dependent on debt financing for basic operations, leaving them extremely vulnerable in moments of economic crisis. And this has been very obvious in the current moment during COVID-19 pandemic. The goals of the working group is to map histories and trends throughout the Americas that allow us to compare very specific contexts, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, El Salvador, and Puerto Rico. Among the core questions that animate our series and our group are: how has debt transformed education? How have teachers, parents, students, and local and federal government officials responded to this transformation? And what projects and shifts are currently taking place on local, national, and beyond levels? In addition to studying these trends, we are very interested in consolidating and supporting the work that we all do throughout the region. As we know, because of the work that we have been doing, some of the same political economic actors that are involved in sovereign debt and related crises are the same. So knowing more about how these operate and how people resist and challenge these groups are fundamental in general to the work that we want to do, both conceptually and as activists. So having said that, I would like to pass it on to Miguel Angel Blanco, who is our moderator for today. He's a PhD student at the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia. And I know for a fact, having been my student, a brilliant young mind, very engaged in these questions. Among his interests are feminist theory, transgenerational trauma in post-conflict Spain, contemporary Spanish popular culture, translation, and creative writing. Miguel, also the coordinator of our group. Go ahead.
Thank you, Frances, for this sweet introduction, and welcome everybody to this second installment of this triggering 4-part event tackling debt from critical, pedagogical, and activist perspectives. And thank you also to Julieta. Thanks for translating this event. I will try to slow down my speech since I understand the struggles of translating simultaneously. So as Frances was just explaining, we have organized for the later months this working group tackling debt from different perspectives and across the Americas. And this is the second part of a 4-part event. To recapitulate a bit, we began last week with the enriching contributions of feminist scholars and activists, Verónica Gago, Lucia Caballero from Argentina, and Rocío Zambrana from Puerto Rico. In this departure of the series, we on the one hand focused, thanks to the contributions made by Rocío, we focused on the colonial extensions of debt and how debt works as a capture mechanism of labor and subjectivities. And Rocío emphasized the importance of tackling and counteracting these colonial extensions of debt, thanks to activism, more specifically feminist activism, through colectivas organizing in Puerto Rico. On the other hand, from Argentina, but also in Brazil, Verónica and Lucia added to the conversation how debt works as a fixation mechanism onto feminized bodies and economies, for which to visibilize the quotidian impact of debt is necessary when approaching debt as a feminist mobilizer. So we have to understand debt as a very specific generator of patriarchal violences, and hence we need to demystify this assumed abstraction of debt. So basically, we departed from the understanding of debt beyond its financial impact, and also with the understanding that debt operates very specifically, not universally homogeneously. So we need, when counteracting these violences, to be situated and also to remain organized through activism that is both national and transnational. So today, we will focus also on interventions and counteractions against debt and beyond its financial realm by hearing the pedagogical experiences documented and performed by scholars and activists Stephanie Huezo, Jason Wozniak, and Raquel Torres Arzola. So before listening to their exciting contributions, please let me briefly introduce them to the conversation. I will begin by Stephanie. Stephanie Huezo holds PhD in history from Indiana University, Bloomington, and currently teaches as an assistant professor of history at Fordham University. Her research interests focus on Latin American Latinx history, community organizing, Central American revolutions, and immigrant activism. Stephanie is currently working on a manuscript that examines how Salvadoran community organizers in both El Salvador and the diaspora have used education to create spaces of belonging when state systems and narratives have neglected to do so. Drawing on more than 30 oral histories and archival resources, she demonstrates how Salvadorans used popular education as a tool for resistance against state-sanctioned violence that cut across national boundaries. Jason Wozniak holds a PhD in philosophy and education from Teachers College, Columbia University. Currently, Jason teaches graduate courses focused on higher education, philosophy, and history for the Department of Educational Foundations and Policy Studies at Westchester University. His research focuses on critical theory analysis of financial debt and education theory and practice. He is completing his first book, provisionally titled The Miseducation of Indebted Student. In addition, Jason is the founder and co-director of the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society, LAPES. And finally, Raquel Torres Arzola is a Puerto Rican interdisciplinary artist, educator, and independent curator, working mainly with photography, video, objects, installations, language, and her own body as a container of meanings in relation with context and place. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Puerto Rican and Caribbean History from the University of Puerto Rico and a Master of Fine Arts from San Francisco Art Institute. Through her work, she explores conceptually the relations between memory, language, gender constructions, and public relationships, and has been exhibited at institutional and experimental spaces in Puerto Rico, the United States, and Spain. At the moment, she works as education curator for the Puerto Rico Arts Museum. As we can see, the itineraries academically, artistically, and activists have placed this conversation as a very interesting scenario to keep navigating debt within and beyond financial realms, to imagine and also to organize counteractions to debt and to collectively disindebt. So with no further delay, let's continue the conversation with Stephanie. So Stephanie, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Miguel Angel, and thank you, Ilas, for this invitation and this space to talk about the relationship between debt and education. I look at it in Latin America, but also in Latinx communities here in the U.S. So I will like to give a disclaimer that debt is not my area of expertise, but I'm happy to talk about how I view debt and give some thoughts on how we can use popular education to challenge such thoughts. So as the panelists from last week's show, and my other panelists will discuss after me, debt is, I see debt as an apparatus, right, where power dynamics are revealed, where sexism exists, and where people are stripped away from their humanity. There is an inherent violence in becoming an indebted subject, especially when one becomes indebted to have access to a basic right, whether that's food, shelter, and in this case, education. Around the globe, students have taken on debt to attend higher education. And in many places, this increase in student debt has also led to student mobilization against this debt and against the neoliberal reforms that have made higher education more costly. But the cost of higher education continues to grow. And in order to make it in a capitalist society, at least here in the US, it is understood that you must get a college degree, learn skills to then contribute to this country. But while higher education promotes itself as a space for developing critical thinking skills, for discovery, and for preparing the future generations, it is working within the framework of capitalism, of debt. So in fact, this liminal time period in a person's life when they are in higher education isn't the free time, right, to think and grow, but instead an assigned time where people spend their energy and their money, many times indebting themselves, to continue within a system that is primarily interested in keeping the status quo, keeping the elite in power and exploiting the workers who work to survive in a world that once again strips them of their humanity and see them only as human capital. Neoliberalism, and in effect, the neoliberal education, culturally values competition, consumerism, and individualism. So the question is, how do we envision a space in education? And I'm talking about education both formally and non-formally, where we can understand the root problem behind debt and find alternatives to an indebted subjectivity. I'm not here to offer any concrete alternatives, but I do believe that using popular education can give us that space to start thinking collectively for an alternative model to the exploitation of capitalism and debt. In contrast to a kind of education that deposits information onto students without any input from the students themselves and devoid from their current reality, popular education seeks to create this horizontal and dialogical relationship between student and teacher. It also connects the world to the subject matter they are learning. In fact, it is that connection that allows people to see their present not as given, but as an opportunity to transform and reinvent. Popular education gives us the space to unlearn how we view power, value, and even education. It emphasizes collectivism, solidarity, and mutual aid. In this view, then, education should help us create the conditions to transform our current reality, not help us maintain it. I believe that it is at the grassroots level that gives us a bit more space to implement popular education in envisioning a different world. Through my research with Salvadoran community, with the Salvadoran diaspora in the United States, I've worked with the National TPS Alliance, a coalition of more than 40 local communities and organizations that are working towards a path to permanent residency for immigrants that have a temporary protective status. In short, more than 400,000 individuals from a variety of countries, including El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Haiti, hold the TPS designation that allows them to live legally in the country and to work, but nothing else. And these communities, at least the ones that I've mentioned, have held this status since 2001 or 1998 in some cases. Since Trump announced the termination of TPS in 2017, The Alliance has worked at the grassroots level through popular education to, one, educate people about this status, about TPS, and two, lobby to first extend TPS and then to provide a pathway to permanent residency and even citizenship. As an alliance, they hold popular education workshops across the country to reflect upon their own current situation and find ways to change it. Because they have to deal with the US government, they also learn how to use political language that the government will listen to, right? That they'll understand. So for example, on April 15, 2019, so 2 years ago on tax day, they launched a campaign to demonstrate to the government and to society that they do not owe a debt to this country. And they use this kind of language. They say they paid their dues, their taxes, and have contributed to the country's economic growth. Now, I want, if it's okay with everyone, I want to share just really quickly an image to demonstrate such rhetoric, right? In this case, can you see it? Okay. In this case, it's a flyer that focuses specifically on TPS holders in New York. And it says, right, that the TPS holders contribute $720 million in taxes annually and nearly $4.5 billion to economic growth via the GDP. So this rhetoric, right, demonstrates that in fact, the government has a debt with TPS recipients, a moral one to be exact. And this again is coming from the language of TPS holders. All the decades that they invested in their communities through labor, taxes, and education, they believe should not be stripped away. Instead, they should be given what they are owed, right? That the government should pay their debt and give them permanent residency. While the National TPS Alliance does what someone that I've worked with says, dio la vuelta a la tortilla, or I guess maybe flip the script, Salvadoran or Central American style, their tool to enact change was limited, right? Because it was still working under a capitalist framework that in order to belong, to be seen as human and have access to basic rights, one has to fit within this capitalist neoliberal script where you are part of a community for what you financially contribute. So again, I ask, what kind of pedagogy, kind of space is needed to imagine an alternative to this indebted subjectivity? How do we rethink our role in this alternative, and what does education have to do with this? I think once again, we must flip the script, right? Voltear la tortilla, little by little in our current spaces. While we may have to work within a capitalist system, we must emphasize grassroots work, dialogue, and challenging power dynamics to redefine production and value. Now, there are models from Latin America that we can use as examples. In the research that I do in El Salvador during the 1980s and during the Civil War, Salvadoran peasants created community councils and cooperatives to meet the needs of their community in response to the state's absence. In fact, the state was present, but they enacted violence onto these communities because organizing to meet basic needs was considered communist, was considered subversive. However, these councils, known in Spanish as the Poderes Populares Locales, or popular local powers was made up of community leaders who made sure to provide food, healthcare, education, and defense. And that's just to name a few for their community. And again, this is during a war. They emphasize constructive criticism and self-criticism to make sure that the councils continue to meet what the communities have said themselves that they need. These councils lasted only 5 to 6 years and dissolved due to the escalation of bombings. Yet these councils do provide, even the short life that they have, provide an example of self-governance, of creating spaces of democratization, of effective participation of marginalized communities, and of critiquing and challenging systems that create what we're talking about, right? What this indebted subjectivity. In fact, even though the councils dissolved mid-war around 1986, there's one community in particular who decided to continue thinking the way that they did in self-governing and purchased the land that they ended up repopulating after the war. A lot of these communities either went to refugee camps in Honduras or lived in the mountainous areas. And when they returned to what's known as ghost towns. People used to live there, but left because of the war. Now, after, instead of trying to fend, each family fending for themselves, the community worked together to buy, essentially to buy at a lower cost these houses, these lands that that was once had a previous owner, so that they could continue to work collectively. And even if they had to work within this new post-war, this peacetime in El Salvador, that they could still keep a semblance of self-governance in their own communities. So I think that, again, it's an example, and there are others, mainly, I won't talk much about it because I'm not super familiar with it, but in Venezuela with the communes that's happening now, there are examples in Latin America that help us rethink and reimagine a space, right, in which we don't have to see ourselves as within this indebted subjectivity. And so what does that look like in a formal education setting? As a professor myself, I asked this, right? How do I work in this neoliberal education system to try to help not only myself, but obviously my students rethink this indebted subjectivity? And so I think that rethinking our relationship with students, connecting our teachings to real life, it's easy for us to alienate, right, what we are teaching from the real world, but we have to continuously make those connections and help our students to challenge the structures in place, to think critically and to envision alternatives. Again, I believe that popular education as a methodology has to be centered because it could help us get a step closer to creating another world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your experience in situating popular education as a methodology and also as a means to rethink critically how formal education and popular education can dialogue to each other in and outside academia, and also making this traveling of activist instances that very clearly counteract the state, and also by transnationally dialoguing these instances of US academia and this indebted subjectivity with activist instances, we can better rethink how to envision these methodologies you try to present in here. Thank you very much. And in this space of thinking, let's continue with the contribution of Jason Wozniak. So Jason, feel free to start when you feel like. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I literally have some of the same words and sentences as Stephanie. So I guess difference in repetition, but we'll see. I also, just to make one comment of something that Stephanie said that I think is really important. Sometimes in education circles, we talk about this idea of the correspondence theory. And basically the idea here is that the social relations of society will get reflected in education spaces. And this is a Marxist approach to thinking through education, but I think it's interesting to think about in light of what Stephanie said, where we would think about the creditor-debtor relation and how that gets reproduced in the education spaces, both formal and informal, that we create. And I'm trying to work on this, and I'm not going to talk about this in great deal, but I think actually one way to rethink like Paulo Freire's whole banking concept, it's not necessarily a banking concept. I think it's a creditor-debtor concept. I think like what really Paulo Freire was talking about, and we could think of more about this, is that teachers put their students in certain types of debt, and then the students have to kind of work off that debt in a variety of ways, right? And then they literally get credits in the form of credit hours if they complete certain work. So I think there's a lot of things we could talk about there, but I appreciated Stephanie's intervention, and I just want to add some more notes for thoughts around these lines in a very short amount of time. And I'll try and speak slowly to help with the interpretation. So sorry, Julieta, if I was speaking too quickly there. So just to repeat some things that were already said, whereas Rocio and Veronica and Lucy focused on their interventions on the different registers of debt or different types of debt, what I'll be focusing on is the other side of our series, which is pedagogies, and to talk about pedagogy. Again, to reiterate the key points already made by Francis and Miguel and Stephanie, in summary, we need to remember that last week, the conversation was centered around this idea that debt is a form of capture. It captures our time, it captures our labor, and more broadly speaking, it both captures and produces a certain type of subjectivity, which some call the indebted subject, so on and so forth. And as importantly, as Miguel reiterated already, there's not a universal indebted subject. And so this subject definitely looks different and has different qualities at different points in time, according to gender, according to race, and a variety of other factors. It also, and this is something that was stressed last week as well, that the debtor-creditor relation operates and functions differently in different, what Veronica and Lucy were calling economies. So different, and I'm going to talk about the economy of education. I think the word economy is interesting if we think back to the Greek word oikonomia, which is where economy comes from. Because oikonomia, you can translate like how to govern the household. And so again, there's this emphasis, I think, if you think about debt economies, that debt is a form of, and this is Foucauldian, of governance, right? Like debt is a form of disciplining, it's a form of shaping an ethical framework, a logic, a temporal obedience. And so in a very Foucauldian way, we could say that debt shapes conduct, how we conduct ourselves. And this is important as a transition into thinking pedagogy. In a very fascinating book, and I'll say it in Portuguese and then I'll say it in English, Oculto nas Palavras, Dicionário Etimológico para Ensinar y Aprender. The English translation would be Hidden in the Words, an etymological dictionary for teaching and learning. Luis Castello and Claudia Marisco point out that the word pedagogue originates from the Greek pedagogos, which means one who conducts, or in this case, one who conducts a child. And from the same word derives the word pedagogy, which roughly stated means to conduct or guide. So pedagogy is related to conduct or conducting. And here I want to note with scholars like Jeffrey Williams, but also Sadia Hartman, who did amazing work on the ways in which debt and education created this matrix to shape post slavery subjectivity of emancipated subjects, that debt has a pedagogical force, you might say. And here we could say that we are not born indebted subjects, or in other words, we have to be taught and we must learn the logics of debt and repayment, the ethics of debt, if you will. And so then we're taught in a variety of ways how to become obedient and dependable indebted subjects that serve capital, that serve the nation, and other forms of power. So again, as Stephanie, I think, pointed out really clearly, these pedagogies of debt, like how we learn and, or you might say in technical terms, become interpolated into the debt economy, happen both inside and outside education institutions. So what I really want to focus on, though, are what would, like, and this is again drawing from some Foucauldian ideas like that he has about counter conduct. What I want to ask is, what would the counter debt pedagogies be? And I'll give some examples based off of work I've done in Colombia, in the countryside, in Brazil, in some urban areas, and then my work in the United States as a member of the Debt Collective, which is an activist organization. And really, the key questions are. The key questions. I think Julieta, we can hear you. There's a little bit of feedback. Can everyone hear that, or is that just me?
We heard it, but go ahead.
Okay. So again, what I wanted to stress was the counter debt pedagogies, and I think the key questions here are thus: if debt teaches us how to be indebted subjects, or if we learn in a variety of ways how to be indebted subjects, the questions I want to focus on for the rest of this talk are, what would the counter debt pedagogies consist of, and what are some examples of them? So here I will try and give at least one practice. Last weekend, Caterina Gonzalez Siegelman, I hope I pronounced her last name correctly, asked a very provocative question at the end of our panel. And I'm paraphrasing, but Caterina asked, how do we undebt ourselves? And in a partial response, Rocio generatively stated the question slightly differently by asking in Spanish, how do we deshacerse? Like, how do we unmake the indebted subject? And to this, I want to add the following notes that an educational practice that counters debt, I think, need oscillate between two poles, one negative and one positive. One would be the unmaking of the indebted subject, or as Stephanie put it, like the unlearning. And the other would be the cultivation of an oppositional debt consciousness and ethics. So I think there's this oscillation that has to go on between these two different poles. Or if you like, unmaking the indebted subject involves unlearning indebted logics, ethics, and modes of being, and the making of a subject willing and able to refuse and dismantle indebted life and the global debt economy. Moreover, and this is lessons learned from debt organizing, that any type of individual debt resistance is often futile and potentially violent, insofar as creditors can easily punish and harm individual debt resistors. And so another key educational question, and I want to frame this in educational question, in educational terms, is how do we cultivate through education the debt movements that are necessary to delegitimize and deconstruct the neoliberal debt economy? So I think there's this process of working individually, but also working on a collective level to create a movement. So it's about individuals and movement. And for the sake of time, I want to shift rather abruptly to a demonstration of some counter debt pedagogies. So the first counter debt pedagogy that I'll focus on is one that I practice both here in the United States, as I mentioned, as a member of the Debt Collective, but also in my classrooms, and that I've practiced recently in Colombia and Brazil with K through 12 teachers. So these are teachers working in rural and urban schools from childhood to high school. And I want to situate the practice of testimonio, or testimony, as a pedagogical practice. And I'm really borrowing heavily here from the Latina feminist group, which was a group of Latina scholars that met for years in the 1990s. And they developed both a theory and a practice of testimonio that I think is helpful here. In their own words, they quote, reclaimed testimonio as a tool for Latinas to theorize oppression, resistance, and subjectivity. And a testimonio, according to the group, is again, quoting, a springboard for theorizing about identity, material conditions, and modes of resistance against a variety of forms of oppression. Testimonio, and I'll talk more about this, moreover, is a method of research praxis. So it's a way to create knowledge and theory through our experiences. Testimonio is both a method of unmaking dominant norms, practices, ethics, and creation. We could say political imagination, vocabularies, conceptualization, so on and so forth. So what I do a lot of work on is what we might call debt testimonials or debt testimony as a form of counter debt pedagogy. And just a couple of notes on about why I think this is important. So debtors telling their debt stories is educational in a variety of ways. It creates the possibilities for debtors to share stories of indebted life that can be the starting point for theoretical analysis of the neoliberal debt economy. Debt testimonies can also be liberatory in educational moments in really important ways. Telling their stories of indebted life is for some debtors a moment of liberation from the guilt and shame that so often burdens them. And this is really common, and I think I've seen this across the Americas actually, that people feel guilt or like they've done some sort of failure because they're in debt. And this again goes to these ideological constructs around debt. More so, these stories, and when they're told in these collective settings, lead to a collective solidarities that debtors learn that they are not alone, A-L-O-N-E, in their struggles, nor are they A-L-O-N, alone. Their subjectivity is not reducible to the debts they owe. And so I think this is one of the things that you start to see through the process of the testimonial work. And so the testimonials not only express what it's like to live the indebted life, but it's also a way to express a multiplicity of subjectivities that the lives being lived can flourish and counter towards this way that's imposed on them. I also think that Veronica Gago and Lucy Caballero have a very powerful example of how testimony works to undo the indebted subjectivity and build a feminist oppositional debt consciousness in their book La Deuda Feminista, or recently translated, and we'll show this cover, it just came out yesterday, A Feminist Reading of Debt. And so in the latter half of the book, what they do is they focus on interviews that they did with a variety of different activist groups across Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. And they say two things that I just want to highlight here. The interview, and I'm quoting, the interview is compiled in their book with compañeras from different types of activist organizations, narrate concrete tactics of fighting debt, everyday forms of its refusal. So again, we learn through the interviews that Veronica and Lucy did, people are sharing knowledge about how to fight back concretely against indebted life. And in this case, they're focusing on feminist movements. And quoting again, on the one hand, they discuss alternative forms of loans and financing that emerge from social organizations. So this maybe goes to what Stephanie was mentioning about mutual aid. This would be like an indebted mutual aid. On the other hand, they show that, quoting from the book again, from the experiences of women denied freedom or in situations of transition or recently liberated, collective organization appears as the first tool to confront the system of complex debt that links and traces a continuum from inside to outside. And in this case, they were talking about prisons, but I think we can extend this to other institutions. In the United States, the debt collective, and this is another practice, brings together debtors in what we call Jubilee schools. So again, remember the word Jubilee means, the abolition of debts, right? And the Jubilee schools are meant to politicize indebted life and indebted people in attendance. And so normally the people in attendance are from all walks of life, but in various forms of debt. And really importantly, we always begin each Jubilee school with debt testimony from the people that arrive. And one of the things we say is that debtors need to come out of the debtor's closet, that we need to show our faces. We need to no longer be embarrassed. We need to show everyone that we are not alone, in the sense that we are surrounded by people in debt and that we need to build solidarity and strength that way. So again, the testimony becomes a place or a point in the Jubilee schools from which our analysis begins and often returns to. Again, focusing on some of the work that I've done in Colombia and Brazil and the United States, and working within not just higher education, where in the United States we have a massive debt problem, but also in other countries like Colombia, Chile, and others, but also working with K through 12 teachers, using these testimonies, but also asking 3 questions to flesh out different types of analysis. And I find this type of work with teachers extremely helpful. So there's 3 questions that I ask teachers to consider in the work that I do with them. 1, how does debt shape your life? 2, how does debt shape your pedagogy? And 3, how does debt shape the school you work in? And so from these 3 different questions, there are obviously across these different contexts that I've worked in and with different populations, whether that be campesinos or whether that be urban school teachers, there's very different responses, right? But there are some important commonalities that I think we should focus on that might allow us to build some transnational power across time and space. And those commonalities are the following. Debt is shaping both individuals, but also shaping the educational institutions where teachers and students are, and the pedagogical practices and content. And so in a sense, when our institutions of schooling, and this is across, again, the Americas, are funded through debt financing, and when we're practicing different types of, or maybe we might say, mirroring the social relations of the creditor-debtor in our classrooms, we're intensifying the formation of the indebted subjectivity that we've been discussing. And in this way, I think debt is highly miseducated, or it delimits how potentiality is cultivated. Sets up unidirectional directions for learning and growth. Students become more interested in return on investment logics. Indebted teachers are afraid to teach certain subjects because if they do and they get fired, well, they're basically screwed. So it really is a disciplining apparatus within these educational institutions. And it produces what one of my colleagues and activist, Rich Levy, calls instructional harm. So the ways in which debt is producing instructional harm deserve a lot of attention. And then finally, debt is hollowing out educational institutions, and or it leads to school closings in places like Puerto Rico, Chicago, and elsewhere. What I think is also really important to note there is that the school closings happening in the United States and the school closings happening in Puerto Rico and other places follow different or similar formulas insofar as, like, you hollow out schools, you say they're failing, you close them, you eventually open them back up as privates and or charters, so on and so forth. And so I think this is the process in which we can see the way that the debt mechanism works to take away public goods, you might say, and turn them into private hands. One of the really important aspects of this is the way that debt covenants are written. So when school districts go into debt, their covenants say that they have to serve creditors before they serve the population. So that's something that might be a pressure point to focus on. Obviously, these closings, this way that debt is functioning in education is racialized and gendered, and we should talk more about that perhaps in the conversation. As Stephanie mentioned, the formation of human capital, again, I think what we're talking about here is the ways in which debt intensifies that process of the human capital subjectification, right? You now need to accumulate capital to pay off the debts that you owe in the present and the future. And so I think that process is really just, accelerated. So again, just to close, that what I want to suggest, and I think Stephanie already made this point, is that given the ways in which debt influences education, both at the higher education level and K through 12 levels across the Americas, it might be counterintuitive to suggest this, but I do think it's that in educational institutions and through educational practices, we can counter some of the ways of the formation of the indebted subjectivity and build movements. Through some of these practices like testimony, through disrupting the creditor-debtor social relation that we produce in our educational situations. And I also think, and this might be me being a little too optimistic, but whatever, we'll just put it out there. I think the neoliberals perhaps made a huge tactical mistake. And by this, I want to say that, you know, if we think of this contradiction of capital, that it eventually digs its own grave, maybe by turning us all into indebted subjects that gather in a common place, i.e. schools and universities, maybe they've given us something to work with. Because as an activist, I can tell you, it is very, very hard to get debtors all together at once. For reasons of work hours, for reasons of shame, for reason of guilt, it's very, very hard to get a bunch of debtors together. But we know in our universities and we know in our schools, we're all there together. And so the question becomes, how do we capitalize on that moment? Like, how do we take advantage of the fact that we have in our midst a bunch of debtors that we can politicize against the debt economy, against the indebted life? And this is where I think, like, we can't give up the struggle within the institutions, because outside the institutions, it's very hard to get debtors together. I mean, it can be done, but it's just a ton of work. So I want to just emphasize that the importance of focusing on those two. I guess I just want to close by just, you know, saying that everything that I'm suggesting here is extremely slow, laborsome, takes a lot of time. And I just want to end with just one quote from Paulo Freire that I quite like, and I think it hints to some of the patience that we need. And in this quote, Paulo Freire is playing with the word esperar. So it can have this double meaning in both Portuguese and Spanish of to wait and to hope. And so the quote in Portuguese is, "Si temos esperanza, precisamos lutar. Y si lutamos con esperanza, podemos esperar." So if we have hope, then we must fight. And if we fight with hope, then we can wait. This is to say that I think there is some hope. We need to fight, but we need to be realistic and realize it is going to take a long time to build the movements that we need to counter the debt economy, to counter indebted subjectivity. Education, generally speaking, is a slow process. So my hope is that we continuously practice this, but also have the patience to realize that this will take a while to come to fruition. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jason, for this super triggering conversation and connections on conduct, education, institutional harm, and also the processual character of becoming indebted and how this is not linear or only has one itinerary, but that can become in itself the way to organize with others in this process of becoming indebted to become disindebted. So in this process, I was also reminded, as you were mentioning, to Veronica and Lucy's work. And since you started with this introduction of economy, how alternative economies can emerge thanks to also popular education, informal education when they are allied, and then foster feminist economies, for instance, and certain modes of disobedience as they were talking about. So thanks a lot. And with this conversation, we go into the last contribution. Thanks, Stephanie and Jason. Y ahora vamos a continuar con la conversación con Raquel. Así que Raquel, muchas gracias por estar aquí y cuando quieras, pues estamos aquí encantadas de escucharte.
Hola, hi, hello. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Frances Negra-Montaner for inviting me and Iras for organizing this panel series. Voy a hablar en español porque se me hace más cómodo, me siento mucho más cómoda, sobre todo por el tema que voy a estar trabajando. Mi presentación es quizás un poco más práctica. Estoy trabajando con asuntos puntuales que tienen que ver con educación y autogestión y soberanía alimentaria. Y pues obviamente todo relacionado a las artes. Así que voy a... Déjame ver cómo... Voy a comenzar con la presentación. No sé si ven la presentación, me pueden confirmar si la ven.
Todavía no la vemos. Ahora hay algo ocurriendo. Ok, ya la vemos.
Ahí está. Bueno, pues Puerto Rico tiene una deuda de bonos de 69.9 mil millones de dólares norteamericanos. Esto es una deuda que se ha estado acumulando a través de varias décadas de malas decisiones, de malas acciones gubernamentales. Y bueno, pues obviamente es motivada también por la situación colonial de Puerto Rico, esa relación colonial no solo política, sino también económica. Además de esta cantidad de 69.9 mil millones de dólares en deuda, las entidades públicas del Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico tienen obligaciones, por ejemplo, de 45.5 mil millones de dólares, en comparación con tan solo 1.9 mil millones de activos netos, lo que significa un coeficiente de cobertura del 4%. Es decir, todas las corporaciones públicas en Puerto Rico tienen una deuda sustancial. Y a raíz de eso, obviamente, no sé si ven bien la presentación, ¿se ve completa? ¿Sí? ¿La vemos completa la presentación ahora?
Sí, se ve.
Ok. A raíz de eso, pues el Estado desde hace varios años tomó la decisión de cerrar escuelas públicas. Se han cerrado un total de 600 escuelas públicas en Puerto Rico. Y para de esos 600 planteles, solamente el 18% se ha estado utilizando o reutilizando, ¿no? Como planteles, como edificios. No había un plan para el cierre de escuelas, no hubo un plan nunca que le diera o le entregara a las comunidades estos planteles o que se las entregaran, ¿verdad?, a diferentes empresas con diferentes propósitos o entidades sin fines de lucro. Simplemente estos planteles se cerraron y se abandonaron de una manera muy violenta. Así que según un estudio que hizo la Universidad de California, estas escuelas pues han representado un gasto público mayor que hubiera sido, ¿verdad?, mantenerlas abiertas, porque pues implica unos daños sociales, unos impactos sociales que el Estado no estaba preparado tampoco para afrontar, y porque no hizo el estudio necesario que tenía que hacerse antes de cerrar estos planteles. De igual manera, por alguna razón, ok, déjame dejar así PowerPoint. De igual manera, podemos hablar de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. La Universidad de Puerto Rico ha estado la única institución pública de educación secundaria en el país. Ha estado sufriendo también durante varios años ya recortes significativos al presupuesto, y este último recorte que se está discutiendo ahora, el 30 de abril, implica un recorte de 94 millones adicionales a lo que ya ha sufrido. Pues lo que implica obviamente unos efectos sumamente negativos para la comunidad universitaria y unos aumentos de sueldo escalonados que están realmente abriendo la brecha violentamente en relación a las clases pudientes y a las clases no pudientes, a quienes pueden tener acceso a la educación y a quienes no. Y pues traigo, ¿verdad?, unos números puntuales. En el 2018 el crédito subgraduado aumenta escalonadamente de $57, que era la base, ¿verdad?, lo que convertía a la Universidad de Puerto Rico en el sistema de educación pública más accesible de Puerto Rico y de Estados Unidos. De $57 subía a 75 y luego a 115. El crédito graduado aumentó de 140 a 160 y luego a 175. En el 2019 tuvimos otro aumento de 115 a 124 el crédito subgraduado, y de 175 el crédito graduado sube, ¿verdad?, hasta para maestría sube a 175 y a $200 el crédito para nivel doctoral. Y ahora en este momento el costo por crédito va a estar subiendo de 124 a 145 en el año fiscal 2022 y luego a 157, 161, 165 y 169 escalonadamente hasta el año 2026. Ese es el crédito subgraduado. El crédito graduado va a estar ascendiendo a 6.252 en el año fiscal 2022, 7.160 hasta el 2026, ¿no? Esto duplica el costo promedio de lo que es un crédito graduado y subgraduado. Sin embargo, el salario mínimo en Puerto Rico es $7.25 la hora. Es decir, que un adulto joven, un estudiante que estudia a nivel graduado o a nivel subgraduado, pensando que porque está estudiando no puede trabajar a tiempo completo, sino que trabaja solamente 20 horas a tiempo parcial en la semana, para poder pagar un crédito subgraduado de $145. Si hacemos un cálculo, la matrícula regular de 12 créditos, que es el mínimo que un estudiante puede matricularse para tener aprovechamiento académico sin cuotas adicionales, ese estudiante pagaría $1,740, perdón, para su matrícula. Esto implicaría 240 horas de trabajo a 125 la hora para poder pagar esta matrícula. Eso implica un total de trabajo de 12 horas a tiempo, 12 semanas, perdón, de trabajo a tiempo parcial. El semestre académico tiene 15 semanas de instrucción. Esto significa que ese estudiante tiene que trabajar la mayor parte o casi la totalidad de su semestre a 20 horas semanales para pagar únicamente la matrícula, sin tomar en consideración los laboratorios, otros cargos, sin tomar en consideración libros, materiales, hospedaje, gasolina, comida. Realmente lo que estamos viviendo es una situación sumamente violenta en Puerto Rico. Y estos son números reales, ¿verdad? La beca Pell, que era o siempre fue históricamente el sustento para muchos estudiantes pobres, estudiantes que vienen de la isla, de clases pobres o de clases trabajadoras, no es suficiente para pagar esto, así que nuestros estudiantes a nivel subgraduado están destinados absolutamente a trabajar para poder pagar su educación universitaria. Esto se traduce, ¿verdad?, a hambre. Esto se traduce a necesidad. Esto se traduce a falta de acceso y a una brecha inmensa entre lo que son las clases pudientes y sus oportunidades de prepararse y lo que son la mayoría de la población puertorriqueña que pertenece a una clase no pudiente, una clase pobre. Sin embargo, claro, si hablamos también de la situación del COVID, que ha aumentado los costos para cualquier estudiante porque tiene que comprar computadoras, tiene que también pagar internet, todos sabemos los costos, ¿verdad?, de todo esto, la falta, sobre todas las cosas en este entorno virtual se ha perdido por completo el ambiente universitario. La vida universitaria no es solamente ir al salón de clase o a atender Zoom para coger una clase. La vida universitaria implica también una convivencia en el campus, un desarrollo de pensamiento, desarrollo de organizaciones estudiantiles, participación en foros, en espacios académicos, compartir de saberes y compartir de vivencias y experiencias. Esto se ha perdido por completo. Y se ha perdido también el activismo estudiantil al estar limitado por completo a una participación únicamente virtual. Y hay que apuntar también que el recinto universitario está cerrado. Los estudiantes no pueden acceder a la biblioteca, no pueden acceder al recinto debido a las órdenes ejecutivas que han estado implementando en relación al COVID. Así que ante estas respuestas, la comunidad ha estado organizándose, ¿verdad? Y esta pequeña conferencia que estoy dando aquí, pues obviamente complementa muy bien los argumentos discutidos por Stephanie y por Jason. Y quiero traer 3 ejemplos puntuales, pensando un poco cómo esto se traduce a hambre, ¿verdad? Y a necesidad. Pues quiero traer 3 asuntos puntuales, 3 organizaciones puntuales que han estado trabajando con ofrecer lo que es la soberanía alimentaria, con garantizar acceso a la comida, pero también con educar para promover ese acceso a la comida. Y esa organización, una de las principales, podemos decir que es el Huezo Bravo. El Huezo es un proyecto de 2 artistas, de 2 agricultores jóvenes, Ian Pagán y Zuley. Ellos están ubicados en Toalta, alquilan estos terrenos al gobierno de Puerto Rico y llevan años trabajando en un sistema de educación y de promoción agroecológica. El Huezo Bravo está trabajando desde el 2014 con darle instrucción y educación prácticamente gratuita a cientos y cientos de jóvenes que desean aprender de lo que es la agricultura orgánica y agricultura ecológica, Por consecuencia, son personas que han estado trabajando para fomentar el acceso a la tierra y para fomentar también la soberanía alimentaria en Puerto Rico. Así que vemos cómo esta organización de base perdona, es que la computadora se pone lenta. Esta organización ha trabajado con cientos de agricultores y hace poco el Departamento de Agricultura y varios dueños de enormes extensiones de terreno y de monocultivos estaban haciendo, ¿verdad?, justificando el hecho de traer agricultores de otras partes del mundo porque no conseguían trabajadores en la isla, y el Huezo Bravo responde a ese argumento, dejando saber que sí, que hay mucha gente que quiera trabajar la tierra, que hay mucha gente que tiene el deseo de trabajar la tierra y de contribuir a la soberanía alimentaria del país. Así que se han unido, no solamente están trabajando con un proyecto que promueve esto, pero sino que también están trabajando con un proyecto que políticamente está activo y respondiendo directamente al gobierno, dejando saber que sí, que en Puerto Rico hay un gran deseo de trabajar la tierra y de asegurar la alimentación. Y interesantemente, dentro de las artes, quiero presentar dos proyectos que están trabajando también con contribuir a la soberanía alimentaria, pero igual contribuyendo con trabajar aspectos que tienen que ver con el textil y con el desarrollo del color y del pigmento en Puerto Rico. Así que la agricultura no solamente la estamos abordando de manera muy innovadora en relación a la soberanía alimentaria, sino también en proveernos materiales para la creación artística. Y este proyecto, uno de ellos se titula Proyecto Armonía en la Montaña, fue fundado en el 2017 por una artista recién graduada de la Escuela de Artes Plásticas, se llama Leila Matina, entre otros compañeros, ¿verdad? Y ellos no solamente trabajan la agricultura, venden canastas básicas de alimentos semanalmente por un costo básico de $20. Ese costo varía según la escala salarial de la familia que desea recibir el alimento. Así que en ese sentido también están trabajando justicia social. Y ellos están también desarrollando investigación en relación al cultivo de textiles y al cultivo de color. Sus keywords que me fascinan, ¿verdad? Dentro de su misión, ellos trabajan prácticas regenerativas, agroecología, justicia social, viabilidad económica en las zonas rurales, democratización de los alimentos, eso me parece un concepto maravilloso, soberanía alimentaria, rescate de la cultura textil puertorriqueña y detenimiento del calentamiento global. Si vemos el impacto de una organización tan sencilla como lo es Armonía en la Montaña, no solamente es un impacto a nivel nacional, sino también a nivel internacional. Así que es un proyecto sumamente innovador y de gran envergadura. Ellos también imparten educación agroecológica, así que ellos anualmente reciben individuos y grupos en la finca para recorridos, voluntariados y talleres, invitan escuelas y otras fincas pequeñas para apoyar en sus proyectos agroecológicos, así que estamos viendo cómo hay una red de agricultores ecológicos trabajando en comunidad para desarrollar mejores prácticas y también aumentar la cantidad de personas que tienen acceso a la tierra y a estos recursos. En Trama también están trabajando con el cultivo y el desarrollo de fibras y tintes naturales. Están experimentando con el cultivo orgánico del algodón. Y lo que me fascina por sobre todas las cosas es cómo han logrado también desarrollar el cultivo de índigo. El cultivo de índigo fue durante el tiempo de la colonización, por ejemplo, de la española en Haití. El cultivo de índigo utilizaban esclavos para extraer el color de las plantas, así que en ese sentido es un color y lo enviaban a Francia, ¿verdad? Este color era importado a Francia para teñir los uniformes de la Armada, así que es un color íntimamente relacionado a la colonización, mas sin embargo la manera como Trama lo está utilizando revierte por completo esta historia y está trayendo el índigo a ser un producto de la liberación y de las prácticas descolonizadoras. Así que tienen índigo en diferentes tonalidades, como vemos aquí, dice acá, la tonalidad azul oscura fue obtenida de la variedad indigofera, que está cosechada silvestremente en el barrio Cuyón. Así que no solamente están investigando, sino que están proveyendo gratuitamente información, ¿verdad?, a través de las redes, y constantemente realizando igualmente un activismo político y creativo, más allá de la academia, donde estos saberes ancestrales se están comunicando desde lo oral y desde el compartir diario, ¿no? De igual manera están trabajando con textiles, y esto es una muestra de ese algodón orgánico que están trabajando para vender. Obviamente esto es un proyecto también de autosustentabilidad, y tiñendo también, explorando este teñido con clavel, con cosmos y con otros materiales orgánicos. Quería también mostrarles un tercer proyecto, que es el campamento Tabonuco. Tabonuco es un campamento que está en la comunidad del barrio Mameyes en Jayuya. Son todos jóvenes también, como ustedes pueden ver. Y ellos están organizados también como un sistema sustentable, promueven la vida sustentable, promueven la agricultura ecológica, y en relación a las artes creativas, Rosaura Rodríguez, que ella es una de las fundadoras, es artista también y trabaja con pigmentos naturales y experimenta con pigmentos naturales, y ellos reciben continuamente jóvenes del campo, ¿verdad? Jóvenes en su mayoría de Jayuya, pero también de otras partes aledañas, para educarles en relación a la agroecología, a la extracción de tintes orgánicos, al trabajo con madera, cómo hacer pan orgánico también con materiales producidos en la finca. Aquí vemos un ejemplo de uno de los proyectos de educación y de activismo también, es la construcción de la cabaña San Pedrito, y estaban trabajando particularmente buscando métodos de construcción resistentes a huracanes, ¿verdad? Y que permitieran desarrollar una estructura estable. Así que están trabajando inclusive con construcción, con arquitectura, o sea, realmente cada uno de estos proyectos está expandiéndose hacia unas áreas multidisciplinarias, pues, ¿verdad?, impensable. Cada vez vienen con proyectos de un desarrollo que también están muy atados a la realidad del trópico, a la realidad del país, a las circunstancias de crisis que hemos estado viviendo en estos últimos años, y respondiendo afirmativamente a esas circunstancias, ¿no? Igual aquí vemos cómo están recibiendo continuamente niños de manera gratuita para ofrecer talleres. Tanto trama cultivo como proyecto agroecológico, tramacultivo y campamento Tabonuco, están siendo auspiciados por ACER como una auspicio fiscal, ¿no? Así que ACER también es otra compañía de base que está trabajando con proveer auspicio fiscal a estas organizaciones que están procurando generar cambios desde la base, ¿verdad? Así que en ese sentido la red se expande. No solamente estamos hablando de agricultores, estamos hablando también de intelectuales, de personas educadas en términos fiscales, que están proveyendo auspicio fiscal y que están promoviendo generar cambio. Interesantemente, la compañía se llama Hacer Cambio, .org, y ellos auspician no solamente a Tabonuco y a Armonía en la Montaña, sino que también auspician a una organización sumamente importante en Puerto Rico, que está trabajando con promover energía solar, que es Casa Pueblo en Ajunta. Igual también tienen Aresma y la Colmena Cimarrona. Así que un poco quería traer ejemplos. Estos son 3 breves ejemplos de muchas organizaciones que se están desarrollando, que se están proliferando de manera maravillosa a través de las montañas del país. Están trayendo cambio desde la propia práctica, educando masivamente. Y claro, a pesar de que quizás el impacto no es tan masivo como si estuviésemos hablando de una institución universitaria que acoge 5.000, 6.000, 10.000, 20.000 estudiantes al semestre, sí están generando una fuerza de resistencia dentro de lo que es el país. Hace 3 semanas fui nombrada, contratada como curadora de educación para el Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico. Este museo, que es una organización sin fines de lucro, tiene 20 años ya de historia. En sus 20 años impactó un total de 862.000 personas dentro de su programación educativa. Luego del huracán María, el primer piso de la institución sufrió una inundación de 4 pies de agua que dañó todo lo que era el Centro de Innovación Educativa, así que ha estado en reparaciones durante todo este tiempo. Esperamos que inaugure en agosto del año 2021, y mi misión ahora mismo como curadora de educación para el Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico es permitir servir de puente y de enlace para estas organizaciones de base que tienen que han creado, ¿verdad?, un ejercicio de resistencia claro, que tienen una organización de admirar, ¿verdad?, y que también están trabajando en promover las artes desde otras perspectivas y desde otras estrategias, cómo traerlos, ¿verdad?, a ayudarles a promocionarse, a ayudarles a estabilizarse, de qué manera la institución puede crear un puente entre más comunidades y estas organizaciones de base, así que con eso estamos trabajando. Sabemos que nos tomará muchas décadas como país poder quizás desarrollarnos en unas áreas que queremos, proteger nuestro espacio educativo, proteger nuestras instituciones es fundamental para lograr esto. Así que esperamos poco a poco, dentro de lo poco que estamos pudiendo hacer, ¿verdad?, granito a granito, poder ir desarrollando el país de otra manera y en otras direcciones. Así que esta es mi contribución. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Raquel, por esta fascinante presentación y que además sintetiza todas las premisas teóricas y también activistas que se han venido discutiendo, tanto la semana pasada como esta. Y me quedo con esas últimas palabras de redes, fuerza y resistencia, ¿no? Y también en esa negociación posiblemente o potencialmente contrainstitucional desde la institución, con grupos que trabajan desde las bases y que no necesitan legitimarse por la institución, pero pueden impactar esa fuerza y esas redes más allá de la institución desde dentro. Así que mucha suerte con ese ejercicio y muchas gracias por traerlo aquí. Y bueno, ahora tenemos un tiempo, espacio para poder hacer algunas preguntas al exponentes. So everybody is encouraged to just drop any question in the chat if they would like to ask anything, any curiosity or question to the panelists. I have some, but I would rather read some questions in the Q&A. There is a button at the bottom of the screen where you can place your questions.
¿Quieres empezar, Miguel, con una pregunta tuya?
¿Puedo?
Sí, por favor.
Voy a seguir en español, entonces voy a aprovecharme de la interpretación. Muchas gracias. Y
ya no tenemos a Julieta, o sea que
okay, sorry. Then I
tenemos que traducirnos nosotros mismos.
Okay, no problem. So thank you so much to the three of you for presenting your amazing work. And my curiosity also as a grad student that is working with students, but also trying to find some gap in between the institutions and the collectives, is how, and I know this is a big question, but if you see, as Jason was telling, esperanza, so we can see some hope, or how to foster hope in these movements, in these forces between what's in the institution and what's outside the institution, but taking into account that in between the two, there is this process of becoming indebted. So there is this commonality of indebtedness, and there is also the disparity of people indebted working towards achieving education, and others that are not towards this path and are trying to redefine also education. So we have this tension between formal education and popular education. And some of these methodologies go towards, as Raquel was just showing, self-management that is also energetic, is organic. And then we have the institution that remains closed, that indebt students even without being on campus, and that makes or places burdens in the organizing dynamics of students that could be politicized against the dynamics of institutions. So taking into account these commonalities and disparities, how do you see now, within the context we are now, the pandemic and all of this, the possibility of politicizing students against the dynamics that are making them indebted in the first place. And if you see that there is a hope towards maybe mobilizing them towards another kind of subjectivity in this process of this indebting. Very big question, maybe, I don't know. Any thoughts?
I have something to say, but Stephanie or Raquel, do you want to go first, or I could say something. I can't hear it. Sorry. Okay. So Miguel, I think you raised a really important question, and I guess I will say a couple things. I think one of the things that COVID has maybe done is be like an apocalyptic moment for education insofar as it has revealed a lot of the underlying tensions and contradictions that maybe are hidden sometimes. So they've come to the surface. So maybe that gives us something to work with, right? I will also say that I've been in Colombia and Bogota and seen students like literally throw Molotov cocktails at the building that the debt records are held. You know, I know the activism in Puerto Rico is very different than the activism in the United States around debt. The same for Chile, and we'll learn more about this next week. But one of the things that really strikes me is that we have so many lessons in the United States to learn from the movements in whether they be Colombia, Argentina, Puerto Rico. The conversations are radically different, I often find, insofar as the ways that in the United States, it's very hard to even enter into the conversation of a critique of debt and indebted life because it's so normalized. That's changing, obviously, recently with calls for student debt cancellation and so on and so forth. But even still, I think there's different conversations. So I think one thing that's very helpful is the groups like this learning strategies and tactics from different places, right? And that gives me a lot of hope. In the United States, we're nowhere near having a student movement that's going to throw Molotov cocktails at any type of debt. That would be, well, I won't say anything on Zoom, but we're far from that, you know. That said, I do think that there will be some sort of debt cancellation in higher education in this country because of the work that's been going on for the last 10 years that comes out of Occupy Wall Street and so on and so forth. So maybe there is some hope that two things, there will be some debt cancellation in the United States and there will be some efforts to have free higher education for certain groups. So maybe that provides an opportunity. I don't know. The ways that this plays out in other countries, you know, one of the hardest things about COVID right now is you see the ways in which countries in the global south have become more indebted. And it's really scary to think about what the impacts are going to be over the next several years of those debts that are accumulating more and more in places like Argentina, Brazil, and others, right? So I'm not sure what the reaction to that will be, but yeah, I don't know. So I will stop there. But
any other, I mean, I think we have one more opportunity for question o pregunta o diálogo entre los panelistas. Bueno, pues yo tenía una para Raquel. Estos grupos, ¿cómo, o sea, es una combinación, el modelo que tienen de sustentabilidad, es una combinación de venta de productos y algún tipo de apoyo, subvención o algún tipo de otro tipo de apoyo? ¿Y cuán sustentable es eso? ¿O hace falta todavía alguna dimensión de ese modelo para que esto realmente pueda florecer a otra escala, ¿no?
Yo creo que hace falta en Puerto Rico una reforma de acceso a la tierra. Se hace fundamental. El gobierno está siendo dueño y controlando una gran cantidad de terrenos que son agrícolas y no los facilitan para el alquiler de terrenos o para proveerle terrenos a muchos agricultores jóvenes que no tienen el capital para adquirir tierras, ¿no? les hacen la vida prácticamente imposible a la hora de trabajar, de tener acceso a estas tierras. El Josco Bravo alquila al gobierno de Puerto Rico y vive de la venta de productos. Tanto el Josco Bravo como Armonía en la Montaña viven de la venta de productos, de la venta de canastas básicas de alimentos, que los costos están entre 20, 25, 30 dólares. Semanalmente entregan no solamente a residentes que auspician, ¿verdad?, su siembra con la compra de estas canastas básicas, sino que también le venden a restaurantes, etcétera. Así que ellos han logrado un modelo de autosustentabilidad ejemplar, ¿no? Y eso les permite también trabajar con sus experimentaciones del color y sus experimentaciones en algodón orgánico, etcétera. De la misma manera, Campamento Tabonuco trabaja con auspicio, busca propuestas y desarrolla propuestas para poder proveer experiencias de educación a niños que no pueden pagar estas experiencias. Y pues sí, aunque Campamento Tabonuco tiene apoyo familiar, pero sí también como campamento y como organización trabajan entonces de una manera proactiva, desarrollando propuestas y demás, y por eso es que fue que les presenté lo que es hacer el cambio, que es una organización de auspicio fiscal. Pero sí realmente necesitamos hablar de acceso a la tierra en Puerto Rico. Esto es una conversación que es urgente, es una conversación y no solamente acceso a la tierra, en términos de acceso a la tierra agrícola, estamos hablando también de acceso a la vivienda. Hay una crisis de la vivienda en Puerto Rico ahora mismo, áreas extensas se están gentrificando, estamos hablando de que los costos por renta están aumentando a un nivel vertiginoso, así que realmente la vida en Puerto Rico va a ser cada vez más difícil, no solamente la educación, sino también la vida misma, ¿no? Y claro, hay algunas organizaciones como Cooperativa Agroecológica La Montaña que los primeros, terceros y quintos domingos de cada mes están proveyendo espacio para estos agricultores presentar, ¿verdad?, sus productos, sus cosechas y venderla, pero aún no es suficiente, ¿no? Estamos compitiendo, ellos están compitiendo con que continuamente los supermercados traen productos de República Dominicana, de Colombia, de Costa Rica, ¿no?, de Estados Unidos. Así que tenemos una crisis también porque como país no necesariamente fomentamos el consumir los productos que nuestros agricultores cosechan. Las instituciones lo que promueven es la importación de alimentos. Así que realmente, si nos damos cuenta, estos agricultores están trabajando bajo unas condiciones muy difíciles y de muy poca ayuda. Así que son proyectos autogestados desde una valentía y un compromiso ideológico, ¿verdad?, sumamente admirable. Así que sí, realmente se hace necesario traer estos proyectos también a las escuelas, desarrollar de una manera mucho más agresiva huertos urbanos en nuestras escuelas, comenzar a enseñar agricultura desde el mismo Departamento de Educación, porque se nos va la vida en ello, ¿no? Sin un país sin soberanía alimentaria, un país en crisis absoluta.
So I just want to say for people who don't speak Spanish that I just asked about how these groups are reaching their goal of sustainability, and basically they are living off the products that they cultivate, and also in some cases writing proposals to develop certain types of projects. But Raquel also mentions that part of the costs involved here that are obstacles is access to land. So land reform is necessary, and also shifting subjectivities about consumption of what is produced in the country, since Puerto Rico, as we know, exports over 80% of its food, and there's already education would be needed at the base of the earliest level to shift those patterns of consumption, and for young people to see agriculture as an intrinsic part of the country's present and future. Back to you, Miguel.
Thank you, Raquel, and Jason for posing these burning questions, and also the means to actually counteract indebted subjectivities that are not only that become subjectivized because of these material realities and the access to land and the access to household, that quite well dialogues with what Stephanie was mentioning beforehand, how popular education in moments of crisis and geopolitical turbulences that are nationwide, but also transnationally or globalized in their indebted strata. We can think of this access or this democratization of resources that are state-owned and at the same time are privatized as a means to contest and to organize, which is not easy and which takes decades until it can be divulgated and promoted. And I think it is very interesting what Raquel was just mentioning of making education or basically to hack education somehow and place formal education as also the place to foster self-management in collectivity, how to care for the land and how to care for the land with others. I think is a key to reach this status of self-management that clearly deviates from individualism and this indebted subjectivity that is so abstract at first, that seems we are isolated in our own indebted realities. So I don't know if anybody has any other comment or wants to throw a question or make a connection to these exciting conversations we've had today.
That was a great summary, Miguel. And thank you for everyone for the contributions. It was really inspiring. Gracias a todos.
Yes, so thank you. I think we're kind of at the edge, so thank you everyone. And I just wanted to say that our next conversation is May 5 at 3 p.m. Movimientos. Miguel, I don't know if you want to say more about who's on that.
Yes, we will have the participation of several activists across the region, and they will inform and also expand this conversation on tactics and techniques that are not only cultural, but also part of wider movements that are situated as national and transnational. So I encourage everyone to join and keep having this burning conversation on what can we do with the tools that we have, and also what can we create with others within this state of the art.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and hopefully see you next time.